usually have Mike with me.
Yeah.
He had a baby yesterday.
Oh, congratulations. Yeah.
Yeah, so he will not be joining us as of yesterday. So it's just going to be me and you having a good chat. And we can now say it's a fireside chat, which is
Absolutely. There you go.
Yeah. So how have you been?
I'm great. I think we met a couple times here and there.
We have met a couple times. Yeah. I think the first time I met you was at like a Crypto Pets event run by those guys.
Oh, down in DC?
In DC, yeah.
Yeah.
And then we were both EF grantees.
Oh, great. Yeah.
We met over in Prague as well.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
So we just keep running into you. So I'm glad that we actually get you on now.
Sure.
So, I don't know. I guess we can just start. And then do you have any questions before we begin?
I'm worried about maintaining an entire hour, but we'll do the best we can. How about that?
We don't have to maintain a whole hour.
Part of your job is to make sure we maintain the hour.
Yeah, well, if you're opinionated and like to rant on things, that's sort of what we want you to do for an hour.
I sometimes rant, but that maybe you want to listen carefully. And if I start going off the direction, you can bring me back to reality.
It's okay. No, we have there's a bunch of different directions that guests like to take. Sometimes it'll we had one guy who within 5 minutes was talking about Jekyll Island, and we had another person who just instantly went off to talking about music, and we were having a chat about good music, and it's like, man, this is
yeah. All right.
Let's get back on topic.
Sure.
I think maybe for people who haven't heard about you as much as we, do you want to explain who you are and kind of Quikblocks?
Yeah, sure. My name's Thomas Rush. I have a project I've been working on for about 3 years called Quikblocks. You might see the name change about halfway through from Quikblocks to TrueBlocks because we tried to trademark the word Quikblocks, and some giant company decided that was not something they wanted us to do, so we decided to change to TrueBlocks. So I've always been interested in the computer industry for 40 years, probably. Very, very interested in the early internet because it was all about everyone's going to be a publisher. Everyone's going to share their own information. And I saw the same kind of thing happen when the Ethereum blockchain kind of came around about 3 years ago. So I had lost a little bit of interest in the computer space in the late 2000s. So by 2012, I wasn't even in the computer space, but then I got back in when I heard about Bitcoin and blockchain. So I'm very interested in data. I'm very interested in sharing data across the world. So that's what TrueBlocks is about.
Cool. And is that your full-time job now?
Yeah, full-time. Yeah, for 3.5 years. So I had my own company since about 1994. Wow. When I got super excited about the internet, and I started building actually internet-based software. So I was building web server-based software prior to any of the web server technologies really coming out. So we had to kind of invent all of our own stuff back then. And I was running a company for about 15 years, basically running a piece of software on a web server, serving clients through a web server. And I kind of lost interest. So then I wanted to become a writer. I went to become a poet. I actually got a degree in poetry about 6 years ago, and I was teaching poetry, but I always was reading about technology. And then I found Bitcoin about 2012 or 2013. And it was just the most fascinating thing I'd ever seen.
Yeah, poetry and code. It was.
Yeah, I mean, Poetry and open source, two things that you cannot make money at.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that this sort of leads me into the obvious question I had, kind of knowing you as the Ethereum grantee. This is it's always great to see people who are doing this full time, but it's sort of like, I feel like you've probably gone from grant to grant, or like how have you seen like this sort of open source space really develop with not a whole lot of monetization paths?
Yeah, it's very difficult to. I started, so I was really into the DAO when the DAO came out. I wanted to be one of the sort of the projects in the DAO, and my goal was always to deliver data from the Ethereum blockchain to kind of regular people. So then the DAO exploded, of course, and it became even more apparent that getting data from the chain was very difficult. So then I thought there's a business opportunity there where you can extract the data from the chain and help people get at the data that's on the blockchain. So, but the more I thought about that, the more I came to believe that if you built a business around extracting data out of the chain, you were almost fighting against what the idea of the chain is, which is the shared global ledger. So then I concluded that my work had to be it couldn't really be a business. And that's why I kind of went down the path of trying to get a grant. Well, so I think my grant was about the fact that I was trying to figure out how to help people get data off of the chain without turning it into a business, really.
Well, I think that's, for people who may not be aware, that's, Quikblocks, you could maybe compare to like an Etherscan, a block explorer.
Yeah, it sort of is a block explorer, but the way I think of a block explorer is both of us watch the chain at the front of the chain nonstop, every block. Both of us look through all the data at every block. Etherscan takes all of that data and writes it to a Web 2.0 database, and then delivers that Web 2.0 data through a website. So the downside of that, the upside of that, is they can deliver it to 10,000 people the way a web page would be delivered to 10,000 people.
Right.
The downside is that they've taken on a burden of data of terabytes of data once they extract all that data from the chain. So it can't be something that a regular user would put on a regular machine anymore.
Yeah, but that's
and to me, what that does is it puts Etherscan in a position where they can intermediate between the data and the user.
Right. Well, that's always the big concern, I guess, in the space, is that Etherscan is this centralized entity that we all sort of rely on.
Yeah, and I think that's a really bad idea. I think that's kind of maybe part of the reason why I got my grant, because I'm literally trying to create a system that doesn't force 10 terabytes of data just to get data about your addresses. See, I think almost everyone that goes to Etherscan probably goes there to look at their 6 or 3 or 5 addresses.
Sure.
And they never look at the other 1.5 million addresses that are created. And I think so that I'm trying to build a system that runs on your desktop and gives you direct access to your 10 addresses without requiring 10 terabytes of hard drive space to build an Explorer.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, because the big problem with, running any sort of Explorer, even, I think it all just comes down to, like, it's super hard to run a node even.
Well, I think there's two problems. I think that, well, first of all, I don't think it's as hard as people think it is. So I've been running a node. I've been running 4 nodes actually in my house on regular computers for about 3.5 years. So it's not that hard. Once you stand them up and they're running, they'll run pretty much unattended. So, and to be honest with you, downloading and installing them is not that hard.
Yeah, I mean, I actually haven't run a node since. I mean, I've spun up like private ones just for testing purposes, but more, the last time I ran a public node was like through my Mist browser.
Yeah, no, and then back then it was a brutal nightmare.
Yeah.
It was an absolute nightmare. And it does take a really long time to sync the node at the very beginning, depending on what type of node you sync. Like you can sync a full node, which doesn't take as long. I sync tracing nodes because I need to get to all of the data.
Like full archive nodes.
Well, there's a difference between a full node, an archive node, and then there's a tracing node in between.
Okay.
So I run the tracing node. The full archive node takes 2.5 terabytes of space on your hard drive.
Yep.
The tracing node takes about 300 gigabytes, and the full node takes about 100 gigabytes. I think those are not the right numbers, but they're close. So there's 2 problems. One is it's hard to run a node, but I think the perception's worse than it actually is. And then the second thing is once you get the node running, you can't really get useful data out of the node because of the structure of the data in the node. And that all kind of comes down to the fact that it's an append-only log of data.
Sure.
And every block is a list of all the transactions in the block, but they're just ordered by time, one after another. And this is true all the way back to the beginning of the blockchain. So if you want to get information on a particular address, there is no function in the node to give you a list of everything that ever happened in the blockchain's history for particular addresses. You can, yep.
Yeah, so basically like it's just not indexed by address activity.
It's absolutely not indexed by address. And this is one of the things that a blockchain explorer does. It pulls all of the data and then it indexes by address. And then you have a nice fast access to a history of the transactions. But the difficulty I see with blockchain explorers is they go too far and they extract every single piece of data off of the chain. And then they have a data size problem because now they have a 10 terabyte database that they have to deal with. And you can't put that on a regular desktop computer. So I scrape every block, and within every block, I look at every transaction. Within every transaction, I look at every trace. I look at every receipt and every log, and I simply extract the addresses from the block, and I build an index as I go of addresses per transaction.
So, like how would I use this? Like, so we ran a DApp for derivatives. So where, you have a derivatives contract address, and then you have a bunch of different, random addresses sort of interacting with it. Would you sort of just, have, you would just pull it, I guess, everything that interacts with that contract, or every person would individually do it on a basis, Well,
see, now I'm getting into like, what does it mean to have an index? So why am I not just like Etherscan if I have this big index of addresses, right? How do I not become just another person that has a list of all these that has faster access to the data? And how do I not become an intermediary between the data and the user? It's complicated. And I'm trying my best to get to where I can actually explain it well, but you have a time ordered log of data, and you're indexing it, which is kind of almost at exact cross purposes to each other, because the time ordered nature of the data allows it to become immutable. So the fact that every block prior to 7 million has never changed allows us to create an immutable record of that data. But when you go to indexing, if you're shoving new addresses into the index, you have to resort the index. And now you've broken the immutability.
Sure.
So I basically do both at the same time. I create an index of addresses per transaction, but I take snapshots of those indexes. And that allows me to have basically a time-ordered list of indexes per transaction. And now I can store those snapshots of the index immutably on IPFS. And and if you ask for your addresses, I might give you 7 of those snapshots because you've only been involved in 7 periods of time. Another user might ask for 23, or a different address. He's going to get 23 of those snapshots, different than your 7.
Sure.
And what happens is, because it's IPFS, I'm going to give you the hashes to where these indexes are on IPFS. You're going to get them through IPFS, and now you have them locally on your machine.
So is this like a peer-to-peer node that you have like a Quikblocks node that you run?
Well, I haven't gone yet to the point where I need a node running. I want, it can work in various different ways. If you run Quikblocks, you can create your own address indexes. It's open source, so you can do that. There's another mode where some people are running it and publishing the hashes to where the index data is, and others will be consuming those indexes, and then they're downloading that file locally, and they'll have it locally so that I can't take it back from them, basically. I believe, one of the things I see happening is everybody thinks that everything that everyone ever does has to be incentivized by money and somebody getting paid. And I'm not convinced that that's true. I think that the human beings are capable of building a system that works because it's useful. And the incentivization comes from its usefulness. So if you knew that you could download the entire index for all the blocks prior to 1 million, simply by running IPFS yourself and bringing down a hash of that index, you would do that, because now you can get the history of your addresses prior to block 1 million. And the same is true for every block all the way to the front of the chain. So I think people are incentivized by more than just money. They're also incentivized by this issue that we talked about earlier, where even if you do run a node, you can't get useful data from the node. So with an index, you can get useful data. And by running your own node and having an index and being able to get all the data that you want about your own address, you're incentivized to do that because you want the information about your address without having to go to Etherscan, for example.
I think the question as far as incentivization would be then, you want it for yourself, but why are you incentivized to share it? And why are you sort of incentivized to, sort of run this thing that, or run an IPFS node that allows people to get access to it?
Because I believe that in the future, I'm going to need uninhibited access to this data. And if I allow Etherscan to become the sole source of data, then the system won't work. And I recognize that by participating in a system where I'm holding part of the data, but you're also holding part of the data that I may need in the future, I'm incentivized to allow you to use my portion of the data with the understanding that I may in the future want to use your portion of the data. And together we all have to build the system this way. Otherwise, some centralizing influence is going to take over the data.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is the whole argument, like with Bitcoin too, right? You know, because technically Bitcoin gets more secure as more nodes are run, but yet, you know, the people don't run nodes. You know, because it's one of those things like, you know, how do you get people to run nodes whenever they're not sort of monetarily incentivized to?
Right, and as I said, I came from the day back in the day when, you know, when the internet was first. We were naively all thinking that we were all going to be sharing information and nobody was going to capture this, and we weren't going to, you know, we didn't even think about the fact that somebody could capture it. But that has happened dramatically and obviously with Facebook and Google and these big players who completely dominate basically what happens is they know everything about all the people that are interacting on the internet.
Sure.
And I'm hoping we don't repeat that same exact thing, because if we allow it to continue down the path that it's going now, the blockchain, in relation to the data, literally we're going to create 10 times over Google-sized problems for ourselves, because the data we're sharing is so intimate and it's so detailed and it's so easy for people to extract interesting information about human beings' behavior, that if we aren't careful, we're going to create a system that gets dominated the way the web is today, with 10,000 times better data for the dominating part of the group.
Sure. I mean, well, you even see it now, you know, in kind of Ethereum land, like you have sort of MetaMask, Infura, and Etherscan that are these sort of centralizing points that we all go through.
Absolutely. And I think this is a really bad idea. So the reason for Infura is because the nodes are difficult to run. That's its reason. The reason for Etherscan is because even if you do run a node, you can't get data. So I love the project called DAppNode.
Yep.
Because DAppNode is trying to solve the Infura, I call it the Infura problem. DAppNode is trying to get more people to run more nodes. But if you do run a node and you try to get data, you'll see in 10 seconds that there's no real reason to do that, because you can't get useful data off of the chain. So that's where my work comes in. Is I'm very interested in DAppNode, and in fact, I'm working on my code running on DAppNode so that people can get useful data about the things that they care about directly from a node.
Sure. You know, but
and let me say, you know, there's also the ability to make the defaults work to our advantage. So a user can start DAppNode, they can start Quikblocks, and it can begin building the index. And it can put that index into IPFS. It doesn't have to pin that index. If the user later queries for an address, that query may identify 6 of the portions of the index as being interesting for that address. And then those things can be pinned, really to no detriment for the user.
So what do you mean by pinned here?
So pinning in IPFS is you can, basically when you write a file to IPFS, it's written to your local hard drive, to the cache on your local hard drive. And it's not pinned, which means that if you write 10 more files, that first file might get thrown off the cache because the cache fills up. But if you pin it, then it won't get thrown out of the cache. And if I tell you that there's a certain file at a certain IPFS location and it's not pinned, it may not be there when you go and look for it.
Sure.
So what I'm saying is that TrueBlocks can build the index portions. It's building the index in portions or snapshots. If the user queries for an address, that's a hit on the index, and then we're going to pin that single file. So any given user would have a different collection of these portions of the index pinned, making it available to all other people that are using the system.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the fundamental like file sharing problem, if you will, in this thing. Like, you know, how do you sort of share a global state across everyone, and you know that we all sort of have it validated? And the answer is that's like what blockchain does, obviously.
Well, I think there's something interesting there, and I completely understand your question. So
sure,
even though you didn't ask the question, you just said something. I understand the point you're making.
You preempted my question.
I apologize. I think there's a difference between pre-consented to data and post-consented to data. So blockchains exist because they're collecting data that has not yet been agreed to, and they're coming to agreement on the data, and they're creating a hash that represents the agreement of what the data was at a certain place, right? And then that data becomes completely immutable. And you don't have to re-agree to whether or not that data was immutable or not, or whether that data was agreed to or not. It's agreed to data. It has a hash. You can verify that it was agreed to in the state that it's being represented as. I think that blockchains do the function of turning previously unagreed to data into agreed to data. But once you have agreed to data, I feel like it's a different kind of data. So any data that's derived directly from the agreed to data has the same quality to it that it can be verified.
So, you know, like, is there a way, I guess, to verify the Quikblocks quickly? So, like, you know, basically you would have to verify it on your own, or else you wouldn't use it?
I think there's a difference between actually verifying it on your own and having the opportunity to verify it on your own. In the case of Etherscan, I can't possibly verify Etherscan's data because they don't provide any mechanism whatsoever for me to verify that data. In the case of TrueBlocks, you could run it yourself and build your own index.
Well, technically you could scrape Etherscan and compare it to...
But the source code's not open, so I can't do that.
Well, I mean, you could like scrape it and like sort of spot check. But, you know, I mean, I get what you're saying. You couldn't validate 100% of everything on Etherscan because they don't provide it.
And not only that, but they inject other data that is not directly derivable from the block.
Okay, I think I know what you mean, but could you explain?
So price is an example.
Yep.
They, in their data that they give you is price. So they don't distinguish between those two different kinds of data where the data is directly derivable from the blockchain with no outside influences other than the source code that went in to do the scrape and generate the data.
Yeah.
So then the other thing that I thought of doing, and I haven't quite gotten to this point yet, but I want to inject the git commit of the source code that I use to generate my data into my data as well.
Like as part of the hash, the IPFS hash, or
Yeah. So create the index portions and inject the hash of the git commit for the code that generated that portion, and then put that into the
yeah. I mean, so we're, so like our new project is we're building an Oracle, a
yeah,
decentralized Oracle on Ethereum, and it's like almost the opposite
yeah,
problem.
it's opposite.
Like we're trying to get data in chain from off chain, and you're trying to take it out, and it's sort of different how like you have problems going both ways.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Different
I think it's a
respects.
real problem actually, because I think the data that has been agreed to is, I call it near perfect data. I think it's as good data as has ever existed in the world. That's the block data that has the hash attached to it so that you can't fake it in any way. And then the problem is bringing that really amazing data both into and out of the chain into systems that are outside of the blockchain.
Right.
And Etherscan and Infura have solved those problems, but I don't think they solved them anywhere even close to the right way if we want to not create a system that is just centralized in 20 years.
But like this, I think this comes down to like, we all know how to do, like we could have a fully decentralized Ethereum right now where every single person is running your miner and your full archive node or whatever, and we're validating everything. But like, that's just so cumbersome that people aren't doing it.
I know.
It's not like we don't know that would make it more decentralized and that would make it a better system, but yet we still don't do it. So like,
I know, and I'm having lived through the internet from its inception, basically.
Sure.
It's definitely going to arrive at a place where you're going to say, boy, I wish we would have done this differently.
Yeah. So how do you, is it an education problem?
It's a huge education problem because what happens is here's what happens. People build systems on top of systems that aren't actually working the way they're supposed to. And then they're captured and they cannot get away from without a complete rewrite of everything. So I think this is why I got a grant, is because I'm literally trying to point out that issue, is that we should solve this problem now, because if we don't, we're never going to be able to solve it.
Yeah, but I guess, how do you solve the problem? Because it's almost not a technical problem. It's like
you solve it by people running nodes and being able to get useful data out of the system themselves. Not themselves, though. That's the wrong way to put it. They have to believe that they have to actually have the option, and then they have to believe that they actually have the option. Whether they choose to use the option or not is a different thing.
So do you think like we force people to run their own nodes, or do you?
No, you can't force people. You can provide, like DApp node, and the Avado is great because it makes it easier to run a node.
Sure.
So I bought one of these DApp nodes, and if you use it, you just plug it in and you're running a node.
But that still requires you to spend money to do something.
That. Well, I mean, what do you want from the world? Do you want a system where you don't spend any money but people control your data, or do you want to live in a decentralized world with?
But I mean, I think it's one of those like, just tragedy of the commons, if you will. Like, if we all do it, it makes sense. But if
it's 100% exactly that.
Yeah.
And if we don't do, I really truly think that if we don't do that, we're going to end up with a system that we don't want.
What do you think? Like it, but I think it also goes down to, like, I always laugh whenever people are talking like, we want to get all these corporate institutions to build on Ethereum, and then it's like, but whenever they get on Ethereum, like, they're not running their own nodes, they're paying somebody else to run their node, and they're paying Google Cloud or Amazon to store all their data.
Yeah.
Like, But to a lot of people, that's what adoption looks like, is getting the traditional world to use Ethereum. Like, how do you sort of square those two use cases? Or do you think that that's wrong? They're never going to use Ethereum. It's going to be the people running their own nodes, on a VPN in their basement.
So it's so interesting to me because this conversation literally took place in 1993 and 1994. It was exactly the same conversation. We didn't have immutable, cryptographically secured data back then, but the same exact conversations.
Yeah.
Literally identical conversations. Shouldn't everybody be running a web server? And people were saying, yes, that's exactly what should be happening. Everybody should be running a web server because everyone should have the ability to publish their own data, their own, not data, but their own view of the world out to the world. And we never even imagined that by not running our own web servers and relying on everyone else running web servers for us, that what was going to happen is the people running the web servers were going to watch literally everything we do.
Sure.
To the point where they know us better than we know ourselves. And if you think that Microsoft is interested in this space because they want to serve a good, kumbaya community thing, and they promise they're not going to watch over us, you're crazy.
Well, I mean, this was I remember reading like the John Perry Barlow Declaration of Cyberspace Independence. Like in the early 90s, that was the whole cyberpunk movement, is that they didn't sort of want the traditional corporate world in there because they thought it was this almost decentralized internet that you couldn't control. So it should be sort of free from regulations.
Like I said before, I started back then, just wholeheartedly in love with those ideas. And then I don't really think I thought out loud to myself that it hadn't happened by 2006, 2007, but I just kind of lost interest in the whole thing. And that's why I went to become a poet, because I'm like, this isn't what I want.
Right.
And then when I heard of Bitcoin, it was like, oh my God, this is exactly what people were talking about 20 years ago. And now it actually there was this new piece added when Bitcoin came, because we re-decentralized, we were doing what we were trying to do. Not that I was like totally involved. I was just more of a sideline watcher, but it was so exciting when I read about Bitcoin 12 years later or 13 years later, because it was the same exact ideas.
Right.
And those ideas are fundamentally what you called the tragedy of the commons, or we have to all work together to make this a different system. And this is what I'm talking about. If we don't do that, it's going to get captured and we're going to not get what we think we're getting.
Would you say it's too late for any systems? I know I've had the conversation with some Bitcoin Cash people, for instance, who would say that Bitcoin's now sort of Blockstream and several other like larger institutions have now taken over.
Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's the fact that I come running back into computer science 25 years later because these beautiful ideas are re-emerging, right, is really powerful. And look at the size of this movement now, right? My son is involved in the Ethereum space as well, right? And his brain is on fire about these ideas, right? So I was a generation ahead, but I had these ideas when I was 25 and 23 and so forth. And now they're back 10 times more virulent than they were then. So maybe it won't work this time, but it's growing. And the thing that's different this time is the cryptographically secured immutable ledger. Like that thing is really powerfully significant.
Sure.
Because it is transparent and it is available to everyone if we can figure out how to get it so that people can actually see it.
Yeah.
And that didn't exist back in 1994. I mean, people were actually talking about all that stuff, but just to generate a 16-bit hash would have taken an hour or something like that back then. So
yeah.
People knew of these ideas, but it wasn't practical. So now it's practical. So that's a very significant change. So I don't know exactly how that plays out.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, what do you see as like the core use case for this? Like for kind of blockchain and say Ethereum or Bitcoin, the true decentralized systems. Do you sort of see there being a use case for the non-decentralized systems, the EOSs or the hyper ledgers of the world, and also because some people say like, oh, Ethereum can be like this global settlement layer for all finance, but other people say that it's going to be more of just this censorship resistance,
yeah,
global revolution.
Yeah, no, I think it's both actually. I think that I think it'll bifurcate into 100% transparent, and not only that, but transparent on purpose, and not only that, transparent by demand of its users. So its users will demand that organizations or companies are 100% transparent. And I will not participate with your organization if you're not 100% transparent. And then I also think that it will become 100% not transparent, so 100% hidden, because it's able to do both of those things. And then in between maybe is Hyperledger and those things where it's sort of transparent when it wants to be and it isn't when it doesn't want to be, or something like that. I think it's actually going to be both. Completely hidden because you're running your own node and you never interact with anything other than the node, and you hide everything before you even tell the node what it is, so that no one can possibly see what you're doing except for the direct recipient of your message. And then it's also utterly transparent in that nothing happens within an organization except in the smart contract, and everybody can watch transparently.
Right. Yeah.
And then things like Hyperledger, you asked, is there use cases there? I think there's definitely use cases there, like, supply chain provenance and stuff like that. But all of those things could be done without the consensus layer of the blockchain, I think. It's just write a better database, basically.
Right.
So those things might change so that they don't even call themselves blockchains anymore or something, because I'm not exactly sure what they are.
Well, I think Corda had that article, Corda's R3's blockchain, and they said like, we're not a blockchain, and because
it's just, I think people ask me like, how can you say that these private chains aren't useful? And I'm saying they're definitely useful. They're obviously useful, but we could have done them before. And then they say, well, why didn't we do them? It must be the blockchain that lets us do that. And I don't think that's the case. I think it's just, there was no impetus to change the existing databases because there was no clear solution that was better.
Right.
So these cryptographically secure databases are better. But there was no reason to change because there was no alternative until this came about. So I think that a lot of these private chains are just a better database that has cryptographically secure data.
Sure. And so I have like another question that'll probably take you forever to answer because I'm sure you have an opinion on it. But
am I opinionated or you?
yeah, no, it's great. So the last thing that you sort of run these nodes on Ethereum. What do you see as the future of kind of Ethereum and like the future of Quikblocks with this? Because they're talking about sharding and they're talking about having all of these separate databases that are sort of connected but not really connected. Like, do you think this is going to be a bigger problem for you guys, or do you think it will actually enable more people to run nodes easier rather than having the eventual 100 terabyte
Sure.
Ethereum node?
No, so I think that we should think carefully about what sharding means to a system like Etherscan for a second.
Yeah.
So they already have 10 terabytes of data, and they're going to get 1,000 times more nodes or shards. And presumably at some point, those shards grow up to be as heavily used as the current chain. So they're going to have 10 terabytes times 1,000 of data. So how are they going to respond would be one question. The same with Infura. How is Infura going to respond? And it's my belief that it's going to not be able to respond ultimately. My system, because at every moment I try my best to stay as small and as lightweight and as unintrusive as possible. And I haven't really spent a whole lot of time looking at sharding, but I'm just imagining that JRush is going to be running a piece of software that allows me to interact with not 1,000 shards, but maybe 3 or 4 shards or something like that.
Sure.
And I think that if it's true that I could run a node that allows me to interact with whichever shards I'm interested in, then Quikblocks would just scrape those shards, because my software is designed specifically to handle the case of a single user's interest in single things. So I claim that if you can run a node at all on your own desktop, then Quikblocks will just kind of interact with that portion of the blockchain that it's of interest to you. And why would you be scraping shard 307 if you've never transacted on shard 307?
Sure. So you think it'll actually be a benefit because it'll hurt the centralized competitors more because they have to actually deal with everything.
Not that it'll hurt them. It's just that I don't think they're thinking about how they're going to, well, they better be thinking about how they're going to scale. But, they're giving away this data for free at this point, and, they're going to increase their costs by 1,000-fold, and they're going to continue to give away the data for free. I don't think so.
But they sort of use the Web 2.0 model, where you give away a product and then you advertise.
And you watch your users and you sell data about your users.
Right. Yeah. It would be...
But then look at Polkadot as well. It's the same. Polkadot's the same. It has if you're really going to be developing a decentralized system, then presumably you're running a node. And if you're running a node, you're interacting with certain parts of the blockchain or certain different Polkadot chains. And then you only have to scrape those chains.
Well, I think, are there any chains that you think are like doing node incentivization correctly? Like that actually are trying to get people to do it in a more decentralized way?
I don't know enough about other chains, to be honest.
Ethereum, 100%.
Yeah, I am actually.
Yeah. Well, because we just sat down with the Cosmos guys for a while.
Yeah. I'm paying attention to Polkadot. I think it's really interesting. I love Polkadot because it feels to me like it has a hierarchical nature, whereas the Ethereum sharding is just like a once across like this. It feels like Polkadot shards hierarchically, so you can belong to groups that belong to groups that belong to groups.
Well, it's sort of you inherit the security going down.
Yeah. I don't
Whereas
know much about that.
and Cosmos is sort of, you can inherit the security going down, but I think it's like slightly, you can sort of define those rules depending on how
So,
you want
what
your.
do you think about the issue of peer-to-peer file sharing? Does it not work?
I don't know if it
Has
works.
it been shown to not work?
So I mean, the storage guys, we're friends with the storage guys here in DC, so they say it works. But I don't know if it works yet. IPFS sort of has its own problems as far as sort of data availability, um, and how you do that. Because kind of like I was saying before, it comes down to how do you sort of keep a file is basically a state. How do you sort of have this share state and all sort of agree on what its validity is? And that's like the whole problem of blockchains that
Yeah.
it solves. So how do you solve it without using that mechanism? And I don't know.
Yeah, I think the way the blockchain solves it fundamentally is it incentivizes people to solve it.
Yep.
So it's about the fact that the blockchain, Bitcoin was able to come up with a way to incentivize people to run the software that comes to agreement. So I have this murky wish. It's kind of a wish and an engineering design at the same time
Sure.
that wants people to realize that we can do this ourselves without having to. It's in our own best interest to not let someone capture this data. And you're right, it's not an engineering problem really, it's a education thing or something like.
Yeah, because I mean, if we all, you could go back to just the basic peer-to-peer BitTorrent software, like for file sharing. If we all just, if every single person was running it and it was great, like it would work. It would work just fine. I don't know. Have you heard of Urbit by any chance?
Yeah, I have actually a little bit. Is that like I what are they, like a operating system or something?
So like their vision is like they're an operating. It's like a blockchain based operating system. I think. So you would basically, each person would be their own blockchain, and you would interact with each other through calls to the
Yeah.
other person's blockchain. So it's like that way. Like your computer is your node for your system, and then it can interact with other person's computer.
I should probably go look at that. I think that's what I'm building or something.
Yeah, well, I think it maybe more lines up with your vision, because that's what they sort of saw as the fundamental problem. Where how do you sort of get people to run these things? And it's like, well, why don't you just verify your own stuff? You're the only person that actually needs to. And if you're interacting with another person's system, you both can agree to do it however you want.
Yeah, I think ultimately, I hope that we're smart enough that it drops down into the operating system, so that you don't even have to ask the question, how do you get people to run blockchains? It's just in the operating system.
That's what I joke. I don't know if you remember the bug or the virus that was going around, like that was being put in people's browsers, and it was mining Monero.
Yeah. In fact, I think I may know the guy that did that.
But like theoretically, like whenever that was like really big, that was like the most decentralized system ever, because people were running it without even knowing they were running it.
Oh, exactly.
So like how could like maybe like that should be like Ethereum's decentralization plan, is we just go like we go spam every other computer in the world and get them to mine. But yeah, I agree. How do you sort of getting people to run the nodes is really the big problem. And it comes down to, like we're dealing with in our system too. So we're designing an oracle, and it's ultimately secured by like people who can vote. So you
Right.
can,
I was just reading about it.
you can vote, but I'm sure you've seen, like, how do you get people to vote in your system?
You get 1/10 of 1% of the people that vote, and it's the 3 developers that built the system.
Exactly. Like if you get 5 to 10% of people to vote in your system, like you're great. And then if you get like 90% of the system to vote, then everyone just accuses you of centralization. So,
It's a hard problem, it really is. So yes, that's what I was saying. Like, it may be generational. Like maybe my generation was so excited, but we didn't have this blockchain tool to do anything real. And now my son's generation is very excited and they have this amazing tool. And maybe it will fall back down into being controlled by the conglomerates. But, my son at 55 is remembering about all of the excitement of this thing. And then that, maybe it takes a couple generations. I have no idea.
Well, I mean, my fear too is, kind of like goes with the funding pieces as well. So like whenever you see like a bunch of companies like pitching or trying to raise money for their blockchain products, all the VCs are asking, well, how are you going to capture value?
Absolutely.
And it's like, are those two things sort of opposed to each other? Like is a central, I mean, it's tough. So you can, obviously like if you were Satoshi, you could pitch that to a VC and sort of still, you could just say like, listen, we're going to mine for the first month and then it's going to be decentralized. So like it can obviously work both ways, but you really have to design it carefully and make sure that when the time comes, you sort of go the right route. Because I'm sure, I don't know if you saw like MakerDAO, for instance.
Yeah.
They had that they just published their report. Their CTO left and he published a report talking about.
Oh, I didn't see that.
I tweeted it, so you can go look at my Twitter. But it was really interesting because they were talking about the two different visions for MakerDAO. Because MakerDAO was originally, it wasn't even set up to do DAI. It was set up just as a DAO, to where like you pay developers for building things. And some people wanted to keep it very, very decentralized like that. But, then the more they took on a lot of investors, they made big partnerships with DAI, and it's sort of moving on to, well, we need to be more professional and more corporate. We can't have, a multi-sig wallet run by GitHub controlling the funds for MakerDAO.
Makes a little bit of sense,
but it's like, and the two are sort of opposed to each other. Like, how do you sort of run a responsible business where you have shareholders and at the same time like keep it decentralized to where
I completely understand what you're saying. Sometimes I feel like I was saying earlier about these 100% completely open and transparent organizations. Like, if it's really true that an organization, let's say a business, is 100% completely transparent, his profits or her profits are going to be exposed to the customers of the business.
Right.
And that's true. If that's true across multiple businesses, you've just eliminated the ability of any given business to make profits above like a true market price or something like that. So, and a VC doesn't like that at all. A VC likes, how can you capture your user? How can you make sure you don't lose your user?
Right.
So yeah, I think it may possibly be completely opposed, possibly. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
We'll have to build some hippie system where we all share some profits.
Unfortunately, it's so interesting. People, I call that the kumbaya reaction. It's like a hippie system. It's like a kumbaya. We're all going to come together.
And it's the opposite of this capitalistic system where we all do things just for profit, right?
I know. But also, it's if we look at what it really is, it's actually all better for all of us if we are hippies and kumbaya people. But you can't convince somebody to be kumbaya. They have to believe that it is actually in their own best interest to do it that way.
Sure.
And that's why people never vote. And that's why these file sharing systems don't really work, because it's not clear why I benefit from them directly. Yeah, it's really interesting problem, but
right.
The blockchain is a tool. I think of it as a tool that may help us understand how to take advantage of the fact that working together is beneficial to everybody. I hope we can use that. I hope we can use it that way. I hope we understand it that way.
I agree. Okay, well, we're actually coming up on an hour.
Hippy dippy. Sorry, I got way hippy dippy on this one.
No, any parting words you'd like to give? Quikblocks.io, or what's the website?
Yeah, Quikblocks.io. We're working on fully decentralized access to the data. Come join us, try to help us on our project. We're happy to have helpers. And I'll just say a word to the young people, being one of the older people. Hang in there. 30 years from now, you're still going to be having the same conversations. And hopefully that time around, you'll figure it all out.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jay. This was great. Hopefully we'll have you back on soon.
Great. Thank you.
And we can chop it there. By the way, are you going to be in New York at all?
Yeah, I am actually. I'm going to be there a couple times for the Ethereum conference and the NYC hackathon. Wouldn't miss it for the world.
All right, I'm going to the hackathon as well.
Yeah,
so
got to be at that hackathon. That's going to be the best one yet.
What are you building? Do you know?
I'm going to build a fully decentralized blockchain explorer. 100%. I'm on a DApp node. I'm bringing my DApp node. So if you want to see my DApp node, you can come over and visit.
All right. I'm looking for a team to build a project with. So if you
great.
If you need a great Solidity developer, let me know.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
So, all right. But yeah, I'll plan on seeing you in a week.
Great. Thanks.
All right. See you, Jay.
Nice to see you.